Hello and welcome to WION Live Broadcast. I'm Simon Marks in Washington, D.C. And these are the top headlines of the day. A US-built F-5 jet in use by the Iranian military crashes into the wall of a school in the northwestern city of Tabriz, killing 2 pilots and 1 person on the ground. Initial reports say a technical failure caused the crash. The Kremlin says it's too early to organize a summit between Russian leader Vladimir Putin and US President Joe Biden after Paris announced the possibility of a meeting to calm tensions over Ukraine. The third storm to hit Britain in a week, Storm Franklin, hammers parts of the United Kingdom with strong winds and heavy rains. Over 160 people are killed in floods and mudslides in Brazil's Petrópolis. The region is reeling under its heaviest rainfall in almost a century. President Jair Bolsonaro promises federal assistance. Firefighters in Argentina struggle to put out a devastating wildfire in the Corrientes region. It has burnt over 800,000 hectares. That's nearly 10% of the region. And Donald Trump launches his social media venture. Truth Social is now in Apple's App Store, potentially marking the former US president's return to social media after he was banned from most platforms last year. At a time when Europe appears to be on the brink of possible war, the presidents of the United States and Russia have kept a very narrow window of diplomacy open. Both leaders have agreed to meet in principle for a crisis summit to try and defuse the situation. But the White House insists the meeting will only take place if Russia doesn't attack Ukraine first. After a flurry of late-night diplomacy by President Emmanuel Macron, the Élysée Palace announced that US President Joe Biden and his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin had agreed that a summit could be useful. The details will be worked out this week when Secretary of State Antony Blinken is due to meet with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. But again, the Americans say that meeting can only take place if there is no Russian invasion. Within the last few hours, the Kremlin has said a Biden-Putin meeting may be premature. Spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said no concrete plan has been put in place for a meeting yet. The summit, proposed by France, could be expanded to include other stakeholders. President Macron had 2 phone calls on Sunday night with the Russian leader, one of them lasting over 90 minutes. Paris says both men agreed to work for a ceasefire in eastern Ukraine and also to intensify diplomatic efforts. And we are joined now by WION's correspondent Susan Tehrani, who is in New York for us. So, Susan, the Kremlin suddenly casting some doubt over what late last night here looked like a possible breakthrough, a summit meeting of some kind between President Biden and President Putin. This presumably puts massive focus on the meeting that's due to take place in Europe later this week between the Secretary of State and Russia's foreign minister.
Yes, absolutely, Simon. It seemed like that meeting was going to take place, and it was very welcomed first by the Kremlin. However, we heard from the spokesperson of Kremlin saying that it's premature, quote, to talk about any specific plans for organizing some kind of summit, and what is right now planned is at the level of the foreign ministers, being with Secretary of State Blinken and Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia. He also said, quote, if necessary, of course, the Russian and American president can decide to hold a telephone call or connect via other methods. Quote, a meeting is possible if the heads of state consider it appropriate. Now, this is, of course, after you mentioned an olive branch was extended by the White House to hold this summit between the Russians and the Americans. But it's hard to imagine that the Kremlin will not accept this meeting and this summit won't go ahead, considering the fact that many are now saying that Vladimir Putin, for the most part, has taken what has really been taken seriously at the end of the day. And this is something that he wanted, short of a complete invasion of Ukraine, and making his intentions very serious. That first of all, he doesn't want Ukraine being part of NATO, and second of all, making his ambitions for Europe's new security strategy.
I think we've lost Susan Tehrani there live in New York, which is a shame. But as she was saying, certainly Vladimir Putin has won the attention of the United States and its partners and allies in the United States after, of course, President Biden indicated last year he didn't want to be distracted by the Russians. I think Susan is back with us now, live from New York. Susan, let's talk about sanctions. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said over the weekend that the United States should be imposing them right now, that they shouldn't be waiting for a full-scale invasion of his country. And he was pointing, of course, to the tensions in eastern Ukraine that we witnessed over the weekend. And there was an indication from Secretary of State Antony Blinken that perhaps there will be some action taken against the Russians, even if there isn't the full-scale invasion that everybody worries about.
Right. During the Sunday shows, Antony Blinken went on more than three networks if I counted correctly, on CNN, NBC and CBS. The same questions were posed to him. First of all, what would be the red line for you to take these measures? When will you impose sanctions against Russia? And, his quotes were basically similar. I'll read one of them. He said the purpose of the sanctions, this is to CNN, in the first instance is to try to deter Russia from going to war. As soon as you trigger them, that deterrent is gone. And until the last minute, as long as we can try to bring a deterrent effect to this, we're going to try to do that. Basically saying that we're not going to impose sanctions until the tanks are rolling in. That's sort of paraphrasing what he said to all of them. He was pressed on whether, Russia is going to sort of keep this low-level attack if it does, whether it's with separatists, whether it's with cyber attacks, and that was coming from Margaret Brennan from CNN. And he acknowledged in not so many words that those were conversations that did indeed come up in Munich, and that there are plans to counter Russia if that happens. However, he said that he would not go into detail on how the West and the United States would respond if sort of these kind of attacks do continue. But he made very clear that as a diplomat, his job is to move with the diplomatic path forward, but I think you're right. We did learn that the United States and the West does have a plan in place that, there are going to be two different scenarios, whether or not it's a full-on invasion or whether or not, which is very likely that Russia decides to sort of have these small incursions or I don't want to call it minor, but sporadic, so to say, and the United States does plan to respond to those as well.
Susan, I'm glad we got you back, and I'm sure we will be seeing you later in the week. That's WION's correspondent in New York, Susan Tehrani, joining us live today. Shifting our focus to the situation on the ground in Ukraine, hundreds of people have fled from the eastern Donbas region as shelling there continued over the weekend. The Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe is holding another key meeting today as Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky urges an immediate ceasefire. The latest satellite images show fresh troop deployments by Russia. Russian troops continue to expand along the Ukrainian border as shelling has continued in the separatist east. Over 2,000 ceasefire violations have been reported in the area by the OSCE. 2 Ukrainian soldiers were killed over the weekend during an exchange of fire with Russian-backed rebels, after which separatist leaders ordered a general military mobilization. The Ukrainian president has called for an immediate ceasefire in the eastern region, which has been torn by conflict for over 8 years now. Let's take a look at a map of the Donbas region. This is where Donetsk and Luhansk are located in eastern Ukraine. They're run by separatist governments and are widely seen as Russian proxy states inside Ukrainian territory. Since 2014, they've been in conflict with Kiev, the Ukrainian government referring to them as temporarily occupied territories. As rebels and the Ukrainian army continue to engage in Donbas, hundreds of residents of rebel-controlled Donetsk started fleeing as shelling destroyed their houses. Long queues were seen at the Donetsk railway station, and people continued to flee to southern Russia, where camps have been set up for refugees. Reports suggest that over 30,000 people from Donetsk and Luhansk have now crossed the border into Russia in the last 24 hours alone. This was after separatist authorities ordered women and children to evacuate the area starting from Friday.
Власти сказали, уезжайте, мы слушаемся, потому что пугают 2 маленьких детей, пугают, что что-то может произойти с ними.
Была тишина, но сейчас выйду на улицу, закрою калитку. Только подходить к двери, слышу, папа, все черно, выхожу. Окна вот разбиты, пожалуйста, вот окно разбито, вот, и вот она торчит в ворот.
Боимся, что нас не переживаем, выезжаем.
Знаете, куда поедете?
В Ростовскую область.
А потом? Есть какой-то план?
А потом, какой у нас план? У нас план дожить спокойно, чтобы дети все остались живы, чтобы жил весь народ спокойно.
Amid the ongoing hostilities, today's OSCE methods to de-escalate the situation in Donbas. With 57 representatives in attendance, the Council will discuss all taken place in recent days, leading to a rapid the security situation. The meeting will also explore all options of an armed conflict. This after Ukraine requested a meeting of the in Vienna to address the issue. Meanwhile, Russia's close ally, Belarus, has announced an extension of the joint military drills that were due to end on Sunday. They will now continue due to an upsurge in military maneuvers in Ukraine's eastern border.
Russia will continue military drills with Belarus, which were set to end Sunday, extending Russian troop maneuvers that have sparked alarm that Moscow could be preparing to invade Ukraine. The announcement from the Belarusian Defense Ministry signals Moscow is not ready to demobilize a massive military buildup that has stoked fears it might attack. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said continued drills make him worried about an imminent Russian invasion of Ukraine. Further ratcheting tensions, shelling across the line dividing Ukrainian forces and Russian-backed separatists in Donbas increased sharply last week and continued on Sunday. Last week, the U.S. warned Moscow might use the renewed unrest as a pretext to attack. Russia has repeatedly denied such plans. Russian President Vladimir Putin and French President Emmanuel Macron agreed in a phone call on the need for a diplomatic solution to the crisis. A French presidential advisor said officials from Ukraine, Russia, and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe are expected to meet Monday. Russia says the West has raised tensions by sending NATO reinforcements to Eastern Europe during the crisis. Western countries are preparing sanctions against Russian companies and individuals in case of an invasion.
And just one bit of news that we've just received regarding Ukraine. Air France has now suspended its flights into Ukraine, joining a host of other international airlines that have done the same, citing fears of a massive Russian invasion. And of course, there's an irony in all of that, given that it was President Emmanuel Macron working so hard over the weekend to try and broker that summit meeting between President Putin and President Biden. Moving on, the Prime Minister of Israel has criticised an emerging deal over Iran's nuclear program. Naftali Bennett called the newly negotiated US-Iranian deal as being weaker than the original arrangement. Bennett also underlined his concerns that the deal would lead to a more violent and volatile Middle East. World powers have been trying to revive the 2015 nuclear deal in Vienna. The JCPOA limited Iran's enrichment of uranium, making it harder for Tehran to develop material that could be used to build nuclear weapons. But the Trump administration withdrew from the agreement in 2018, and the deal was left in tatters. Israel has been a staunch opponent of the JCPOA. Now it's urging negotiators to take a harder line against Iran in the current round of talks. In a speech to Jewish American leaders, the Israeli Prime Minister warned that Iran has used the interim period to pursue its enrichment to levels approaching weapons grade. Since the original timeline of a deal may not be extended, noted the 10-year limits on enrichment and other key aspects of the original agreement are set to be lifted in the year 2025. That's just 2.5 years from now, and this leaves Iran with a fast track to military-grade enrichment.
The single biggest problem with this current agreement is that it's in 2.5 years. 2.5 years, which is right around the corner. Iran, by this agreement, will freely develop, install, and operate advanced centrifuges. For Israel and all the is highly likely to create
that Israel will not allow Iran to become a threshold state, insisting that Israel would not be bound by a new deal.
Of joint concern. So yes, there are challenges, but we're up nuclear thresholds. We have a clear and unnegotiable red line. Israel of action to defend itself.
Israel, of course, considers Israel wants an improved deal that places tighter restrictions on Iran's nuclear program and wants the deal to address program and also its support for hostile proxies along Israel's borders, including the Lebanese militant group Hezbollah. That the negotiation correspondent Jody Cohen has spoken exclusively to the former ambassador of Israel to India, Mark Sofa, and he's expressed concern over the Iran nuclear deal, saying that it will lead to more violence.
Ambassador, Prime Minister Bennett has expressed concern over the Iran deal that's been so far as to say...
First of all, I think it's necessary to look at the very background of all of the Iranian approach to Israel and to the Middle East as a whole. For us, it's actually an existential, even another military conflict. It's actually existential. Agreement, and this, according to reports, haven't seen the agreement, is that two things have happened. Number one is time as a time-based agreement, that's point number one. And point number two, no less in that period of time, Iran has greatly increased its capabilities. So two things have happened, and we're still stuck with the same time in the first agreement. So yes, I think we are justifiably worried at what seems to be the outcome of this agreement. As I say, Iran has chosen its approach, and its approach is one of violence, death and destruction throughout the Middle East, incidentally, not just as far as Israel is concerned.
It is a busy Monday. There's a lot going on in terms of those Iran talks in Vienna and also, of course, the crisis over Ukraine. We will have continuing coverage of both of those stories and all the other major developments taking place around the world right here on WION. I'll be back with another edition of WION Live Broadcast from Washington tomorrow. But between now and then, stay with WION. World is one.
Many other questions, right? Arab?
Stay connected.